There's a lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel. From San Francisco, Gloria La Riva is the coordinator of the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee in the United States. Here in our studio, Pedro Burelli is a former member of the executive board of Petroleos de Venezuela, the oil company. Also with us, Michael Shifter is the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. And joining us from Caracas via Skype, Lucas Koerner is a journalist and political analyst at VenezuelaAnalysis.com. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Lucas, let me start with you. Given the situation that our reporter just described to us in Venezuela, where does this leave Nicolas Maduro and his government? I mean, how much pressure is he under right now?
Well, I think that it's clear that there's a coup underway in Venezuela. I mean, that is what is going on. The United States has effectively appointed an interim president in Venezuela in violation of the Constitution and is attempting to economically further its economic strangulation of the country through a possible intensification of asphyxiating economic sanctions in an attempt to foment a division within the armed forces and the overthrow of the government. I mean, all of this is out in the open. It's very clear what is taking place, and it's really the question of will the international community, besides the United States and its close allies, its conservative and right-wing allies, will the international community stand for another coup to take place in Latin America in an era that is supposed to be beyond coups? This is supposed to be what happened 40, 50 years ago, not what is supposed to be taking place in the 21st century.
All right, Michael Shifter, there we heard Lucas call this a coup, but as our reporter told us, there is a provision in the Venezuelan constitution which would allow the president of the National Assembly, who in this case is Juan Guaido, to take charge of the country. So right now, is it a question of legitimacy?
No, I think the legitimacy is clearly with Guaido. He has the constitution behind him. He has legitimacy, legality. Look, the problem is that Maduro has power. With being backed, at least until now, although it could change, by the armed forces, and he's sort of managing the country. But Guaido has legitimacy. This is, on May 20th, Maduro was elected in a fraudulent election that was widely denounced, and it was not recognized by most countries. And he's clearly resorted to dictatorial rule, and so I think. The National Assembly was elected in December of 2015, and Guaido is now the president, and I think he has legitimacy.
All right, but I'm wondering to what extent, Michael, this gets complicated because of the United States involvement in this. CNN reported earlier today that U.S. officials have been meeting leaders of a rebel military group in Venezuela. There was a group that tried to stage a coup in Venezuela. That was put down. That group has been arrested. And let's listen to what U.S. Vice President Michael Pence said on Tuesday in a statement on Venezuela. Let's watch this.
Let me express the unwavering support of the United States as you, the people of Venezuela, raise your voices in a call for freedom. Nicolas Maduro is a dictator with no legitimate claim to power. He's never won the presidency in a free and fair election, and he's maintained his grip of power by imprisoning anyone who dares to oppose him.
So, Michael, does this put a big question mark over what's going on in Venezuela?
Well, I think we have to be, I think this has to proceed in a democratic constitutional way. And I think Guaido's statements have been very much in keeping with that spirit.
Right.
He has legitimacy on his side. He obviously has been able to energize and unify the opposition. And he is trying to pressure the government. This is called the democratic process. And so clearly, if there is an unconstitutional or a military solution, that's not the solution, or a violent solution, that's not what we want. But so far, I think Guaido has been pursuing the right path. It's a tricky one, but I think it's the right one.
Right. Let me bring in Gloria. Gloria, President Maduro has not resigned, and this is how he has responded to this latest turn of events. Let's watch this.
Como presidente constitucional,
as constitutional president, head of state, head of government, in fulfillment of my duties that I swore before the people to respect and enforce the independence, sovereignty, and peace of the Republic, I've decided to break diplomatic and political relations with the imperialist government of the United States.
So, Gloria, we have the United States, which has recognized Juan Guaido as the new head of state. So has Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Paraguay, the Organization of American States as well. What do you make of what's going on there?
Actually, that is not true. The Organization of American States has not endorsed Guaido, who is a pretender and illegitimate claim to the presidency. Canada and the United States have headed up the OAS for decades, dominating it on behalf of U.S. capital, and in this instance, U.S. oil corporations. The so-called claim by Guaido that according to the Constitution he can declare himself president is false. It's only in the case of an absolute vacuum, and that is not the situation. Nicolás Maduro is the ruling president, justifiably elected by the people for a second term. Trump and Pence and Pompeo and John Bolton can put any kind of label they want of dictatorship, tyranny, lack of democracy, anything they want to say. But the truth is there. And we're living in the era of lies emanating from the White House, but what it brings behind it, if they were to succeed in this coup, is a great danger to millions of Venezuelans, a fascist coup that will mean death and suffering for many people. And the ultimate aim for the U.S. is control of the oil resources, the largest in the world.
Pedro, so here we have claim, counterclaim, who's right, who's wrong, who's legitimate, who isn't. Seems like a recipe for chaos in the country.
Quite the contrary. I think we're watching something that was almost difficult to imagine. We're watching a constitutional solution that is, it's our Constitution. It's not people's interpretation from San Francisco what the Constitution is. I'm pretty sure that your previous guest is not a constitutional lawyer. It's democratic because the National Assembly is recognized as a sole democratic institution in Venezuela. It will lead to elections that have to conform to a series of terms to be free, fair, where everybody can participate. And the way the elections that Maduro had were not, that's why they were declared and not recognized, and it's being peaceful. The second thing is, I find it very interesting that people talk about the right-wing governments. The strongest government in the Americas has been Canada. The last thing I think people would call is Justin Trudeau a left wing, and his relationship with Trump is not that good either. So it's more interesting to focus on why countries like Canada or countries like Peru, Panama, Costa Rica, and all those have actually come in to support what's going on. And I think none of those are right-wing governments. We're finding a solution in the Americas.
I'll get you in a moment, Gloria.
We're finding a solution in the Americas with the Americas. Who was caught sleeping a little bit on the switch when the Group of Lima on the 4th of January put out their resolution, basically telling Mr. Maduro not to swear himself in and the National Assembly to assume control, was the United States, which is not a member of the Group of Lima. So there's 13 countries in the Americas decided that. And I actually believe Canada is a member, the United States is not a member. And the United States, this is not something that happened overnight. As your correspondent from Caracas said, this has been going on literally since the 4th of January, at least in terms of the Group of Lima, the swearing in of Juan Guaido as president.
Pedro, just clarify for us, because this seems to be a point of contention here. Just clarify for us, what are the circumstances, or as we're calling it here, the vacuum, that would exist that would enable the president of the National Assembly to take office as head of state?
Well, in Venezuela, under Venezuelan law, presidential periods are 6 years long. And the period that Maduro won in a contested election, but that that he still served his term, would end on the 10th of January. There had to be an election, and normally in Venezuela, those elections occur about a month before the period is over. So in December of last year, 2018, there should have been an election. Maduro actually ran an election in May, where a lot of people who could have run against him were inhabilitated from running, or in jail, or in exile. The election was run in a manner in which a very small percentage of the population participated in the election, okay? And 70 countries in the world did not recognize him. So we were always going to have this crisis coming the end of the period.
Right, and I'm wondering to what extent, this is a question I put to Michael as well, has this been complicated by the fact that the United States has been talking to Venezuelan military, rebel military officials?
I think
that's the one thing. President Trump just said a few days ago he does not rule out a military option.
No, I think it's wrong. First, Hugo Chavez militarized the government and politicized the military. Anybody who has to deal with Venezuela will have, by necessity, to meet with military people because they're all over the government. So by definition, this has been a military crisis in addition to a political crisis. So So that is the point. I think for any country, they have to meet with people in the civil society, people in the church, people in the opposition, people in the military. That's what you do when you look at a country that is in a profound crisis.
All right, let me go. Gloria, go ahead.
Yes, excuse me, but the Constitution provided for the ability of the government to call for a constituent assembly. That was legitimate in 2017. And several times in the last 20 years, the U.S. has directed the opposition, the right wing, however you call it, has directed them to either abstain or run. When they run, they lose miserably. When they abstain, then they have no right to denounce the elections. The elections were contested because they were allowed to run, and they chose not to, except for Henry Falcon. Now, the Constitution provided for this new constituent assembly. The National Assembly, right wing, whose majority had been elected in 2015 because of an economic crisis, thanks to corporate hoarding, thanks to U.S. sanctions, the National Assembly began to disassemble laws that had been protecting millions of people. They wanted to privatize the housing that had been built by the oil reserve to benefit the people, and the privatization would have dismantled the housing for the people. This is why the Supreme Court ruled it illegitimate, because it had seated several members that were illegally elected, and it has broken the law. But what's really at hand here is the danger. The gentleman who just spoke was talking about peaceful. There has been no peace by the opposition. They've called for violence. They have supported coup attempts. They've supported the murder of dozens of people in the last several years by violent blockades, barricades, and outright murder. This coup attempt that happened the other day militarily is violence, and it's an attempt to overturn the will of the people of Venezuela. And we in the United States, many activists are calling for actions today, tomorrow, and however long it takes to demand no U.S. interference, no coup, and lift these devastating sanctions. Now we see U.S. courts and the U.S. government attempting to take over the ownership of Citgo's oil properties in the United States.
All right, I want to go to Lucas.
The key is oil.
I want to go to Lucas. Lucas, we haven't heard from the Venezuelan military so far. What do they think? Have they said anything? I mean, who do they back in this?
We actually have General Pedro Lopez did just issue a statement a few hours ago saying that the armed forces would not recognize what he described as the imposed president of Venezuela, and would continue to defend national sovereignty and recognize the leadership of Nicolas Maduro. If I can comment very quickly, that I think that we're seeing it's very clear on what is policy on Venezuela, because if we recall in 2017, during the insurrectionary anti-government protests that led to over 100 deaths, the United States was calling for early presidential elections. Subsequently, when those elections were moved forward to May, in the United States refused to recognize them. And then afterwards, once those and then demanded new elections. And now we don't even know, there's no talk of elections. The United States is simply just appointed. Not only the United States refused to recognize those elections, it threatened to sanction the opposition presidential candidate, Henry, according to his top advisor, Francisco Rodriguez. I mean, clearly there is a U.S. effort to delegitimize the electoral process in Venezuela, and there's a Where's Waldo of U.S. policy.
Okay,
right now.
Michael, clearly there is a divide in Venezuela. How significant is it on which side the military falls?
Oh, it's extremely significant. They have the real power. They control the territory. They control the country in Venezuela, and they have responsibility. It's very, very important. And I think that what we saw today was a tremendous display of unity and broad opposition. These are not also the usual opposition figures from the middle class in Venezuela. These are very, very poor Venezuelans, many of them very sympathetic to Hugo Chavez, that are just, fed up, and they're suffering terribly. I mean, was reference to that if this scenario plays out, Guaido being president, there's going to be tremendous misery and suffering in the country. It's hard to imagine it getting any worse. We've never seen this in the history, modern history of Latin America. I mean, you have to start as a point of a departure. People leaving, 3 million people have already left in the last couple of years. All these countries that are declaring, that are not recognizing Maduro and recognizing Guaido, are all dealing with this tremendous exodus of Venezuelans.
Right.
I mean, that's also not an irrelevant factor in this whole in this whole equation. But the military, so far, they have a lot at stake in this regime. They've made a lot of money. They have a lot of interests. And I think there has been an amnesty law that was approved in the National Assembly, but I think that's the issue. It's very tricky, but I think that's the issue that needs to be worked out in order to make this a nonviolent transition.
One other development, Michael, and that is, well, we have the United States, Canada, and other countries in Latin America that have recognized Juan Guaido, but we also have Russia on the other side that's criticized the United States, Mexico, Bolivia, that haven't recognized him.
Right. Well, I think that's expected. Mexico is part of the Lima Group, although it didn't support the Lima Group's declaration. They're trying to sort of play a middle ground, and obviously it's not working very well. And the other countries, you know, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, are part of the alliance with Venezuela. They're loyal to Maduro. They're not going to change. Russia, I think, for its own sort of geopolitical projection, are going to recognize it. We haven't heard from China yet. It'd be interesting to see what China says, because I think China's interested in stability. And I think now in Venezuela, stability means Guaido and making that transition as smooth as possible.
That's not true.
Pedro, if we look at the new leader, how much support, the one who's calling himself the new leader, how much support does he have?
Well, I think you started a program, and I think you used the word thousands. I think your representative said hundreds of thousands. I think he has a very, very broad support. Juan is a young man at 35, but he's been in Congress for 9 years already, even though he's 35. I think Juan was, the leader people were expecting, a guy who doesn't know how to scream, a guy who looks like, he's from a very, middle to low class family, hardworking family. And I think he came in to unify the country where a lot of egos were in the middle, trying to fight a highly polarized situation. I think he has a support. I think in this case, it's easy to see it. I think if you look at, do a pan, not just of Caracas, but you look at Caracas, Maracaibo, Barquisimeto, all the main cities, and you see how many people came out today on this rally to kind of support and to give back into what he has done. So this is a process that started with him being elected as president of the National Assembly, then invoking the articles of the Constitution that he had to invoke on the 11th, and then he gave time for people to understand through multiple town halls until we had this event in which he then assumed all the executive powers. And the recognition of the countries didn't come instantly. The countries have been watching this process. They've had their lawyers looking at what this means. And what you will see is that Nicolás Maduro can stay in the presidential office for as long as he wants, but the levers of power are firmly in the hands, because Venezuela, as an exporter of oil, as a country that owes a lot of money, the person who actually will be able to have the relationship with bondholders, with financial institutions, with the country's assets outside, is the one who's going to run this show. The military understands that. You're going to see a military response very, very quickly, because I think what the military was waiting to see, if this constitutional thing had the support that was required for them to have to switch sides. I have absolutely no doubt, no doubt whatsoever, that Juan is perceived by the majority of the people as a leader right now.
Okay, I'm going to go to Gloria. Gloria, how important is public opinion in this, and which side of this divide the public opinion in Venezuela is going to fall? Because as our reporter told us at the beginning of the program, Venezuela has been in a deep recession. Thousands of Venezuelans have left the country. There are shortages of food items. To what extent is that driving what is going on?
First of all, the claim that 3 million people have fled Venezuela is false. It is not near that many people, and you cannot talk about the economic crisis or the difficulty people face until you understand that 5 medical shipments of medicine that the people need for vaccinations and illnesses like diabetes have been blocked by the United States sanctions on the banks, prohibiting them from accepting Venezuelan money for transactions for medicine. And that's not even to speak of the food that's been denied because of the hoarding by corporations, this economic war that's taken place for many, many years. And it's going to get much worse until the U.S. tries to force a change and a coup. We only have to look at, wait, excuse me, you gave the last speaker plenty of enough time. The last coup that took place under the direction of the United States was in Honduras, 2009, in June. And since that coup, we have seen tens of thousands of Hondurans in a small country of 10 million people fleeing in caravans, risking death, dying along the road to come to the United States and blockaded by the United States. It's interesting that the U.S. doesn't care about those refugees, but this is the result of U.S. coup. that has killed hundreds and hundreds of social activists, environmentalists, journalists in Honduras, and nobody speaks of that now that the coup has taken place. This will happen many more times in Venezuela if the U.S. were to succeed. It is a U.S. coup, and the U.S. has no right to interfere in any country. This claim of the Group of Lima, it's an artificial creation, and it's a minority of the countries in the OAS, and yes, they are right-wing, including a country like Brazil, whose most popular politician, Da Silva Lula, is in prison because they don't want him to return, because if he were allowed to run, he would win the presidency. This is manipulation by the U.S.
All right, I want to move on to Michael. Gloria says the situation could get worse. How precarious is the situation in Venezuela right now? I mean, do you see a quick resolution to this?
I don't think this is going to be resolved tomorrow. We have this very, very odd situation of having parallel governments, basically.
Yeah.
And so Maduro says one thing, and then Guaido says something else. And will the countries follow what Guaido says or follow what Maduro says? It's not an easy situation to. I mean, there aren't many precedents at this. I think what your reporter said, that we're in uncharted territory, is precisely right. So I don't think this has an immediate resolution, but I think clearly there is a momentum building, and it's in favor of the opposition. It's in favor of Guaido. There's a deep crisis within the government, and there's intensifying pressure internationally. And so I think all the combination of all those factors means that we're looking towards a path toward transition, eventual transition. I don't think it's going to happen right away. It could take some time, but I think we're heading in that direction.
Very quickly, Pedro, we just got a few minutes left. How do you see this unfold?
I see this unfolding. I tend to disagree with Michael, but we tend to disagree pretty often. I think this is going to be much faster because this duality has to be resolved. And the fact is that the levers of power for a country that has basically huge amounts of debt, they have creditors who want to have a conversation with somebody. They would like to have a conversation with Guaido. They have clients who are buying oil. They like to have, conversations with the people who are really will be making the decisions. So, like I said, Mr. Maduro can stay as long as he wants in a palace, but the levers of power have now shifted, and he's going to realize that. And I think Maduro will understand very quickly that his situation is untenable.
Okay, Gloria. What do you see happening in the days ahead, the weeks ahead? Do you see Nicolas Maduro reassert his power throughout the country?
Nicolas Maduro is the president. There's no equal sign between him and Guaido. There's no contingency. The point is this, is that Maduro was elected, and I believe the people will fight to defend their rights. The U.S. is going to continue pressuring, killing people through economic sanctions, killing people militarily. I think it's a very dangerous situation. And again, the people of the U.S. must speak up against another U.S. intervention in Latin America, adding to its sordid history in that continent.
Okay, we have to go. Thanks to all of you for being on the show. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arun Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us. Thank you.